Hello and welcome to Bridge City Bible Church. I'm excited for you to join us today as we start in John chapter 11. We are going to be going through verses 1 through 16. And so we are at the halfway point of the book, which has been fantastic. The series is called And the Word Became Flesh. Because John is trying to show us that the Word, who he says was with God and was God and is God, then became flesh, became incarnate, came into human history. And ultimately, his whole purpose of this is to show that Christ is, or Jesus is the Christ, and that in him there's life. And so today, as we look at the passage that we're going to look at, and this is actually getting into the chapter where Jesus raises Lazarus from the dead. It's this absolutely beautiful story. And Jesus reveals even more about who he is, which we're going to look at next week. It's just this great chapter, this great passage, but it's this great miracle showing how Jesus is the resurrection. But today we're gonna be looking just at the first 16 verses. So it's even before Jesus gets to the place and gets to Bethany where Lazarus and his family lives. So he's not even going to get to that town yet. So today we're going to be talking about the things that happened beforehand. And so one of the things I've been kind of going through and thinking about this week is the idea of strategy games. I really like strategy games, like a game like Risk, a game like chess. There's so many other types of strategy games that are out there. And one of the most important things about a strategy game is to always be thinking 2, 3, 4 moves ahead. And if you can be 4 moves ahead of your opponent, then you can kind of manipulate them to do what you need to do so that you can defeat them. But that's easier said than done in a lot of cases because there's so many variables. It depends on the type of person you're playing. It depends on the person's experience. There's so many other things. You can be sitting there thinking, I have 3 moves ahead of this guy, but in actuality, that guy's goading you into his 3 or 4 moves ahead. And so there's too many variables for us to actually have 100% certainty what's going on. Now, the best players in the world are really good at planning and strategizing based off of what's happening. But the reality is you cannot know 100% as to what is going on. The reason why I bring that up is because today we're actually going to see how God uses something that is extremely bad to bring about his will, to bring about his glory. And the fact is if God is sovereign, which was something we looked at last week, and if God is in full control, then we can actually 100% trust that what he has planned is perfect because he sees all, knows all, and is in control of all. Anyways, I'm jumping ahead. Today we're going to be breaking the passage off up into verses 1 through 4 and then 5 through 16. So we're going to jump right into this story. John chapter 11, let's take a look at it. Verses 1 through 4. Now a certain man was ill, Lazarus of Bethany, the village of Mary and her sister Martha. It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. But when Jesus heard it, he said, This illness does not end in death. It is for the glory of God, so the Son of Man might be glorified through it. So John's setting up what's going on, and he's introducing us to the man Lazarus. Now he introduces where they're from, which is Bethany. Bethany was a village that was just outside of Jerusalem and actually became the home base for Jesus' ministry in the late part of his ministry. Because we have to realize that this is actually taking place after the winter festival of Hanukkah, or the Feast of Dedication, and then it's in between that and the Passover. So this is we're looking at probably a month and a half, maybe 2 months until Jesus is going to be turned over, arrested, and killed. And so there's not much left in Jesus' ministry. But for the last little bit in his ministry, his home base was Bethany. So we're introduced to Lazarus and his the brother of Mary and Martha. Mary and Martha are mentioned in Luke chapter 10, verses 38 through 42. There's the story of Jesus visiting the house, and Mary's sitting at Jesus' feet and listening, and Martha is in the is in the back. She's cooking. She's doing all those things. She's the host. And she gets angry because Mary's not helping. And Jesus actually puts her in her place and it's like, Mary's doing what she needs to do, which is sitting and listening at my feet. And so there's just, there's a history that takes place. There's a relationship. And in fact, if you look at this passage as a whole, there's multiple times where it's mentioned that the Lazarus of whom you love, or Jesus loved this family. There was a great, deep built relationship that he has with this family. And so we're introduced that Lazarus from Bethany, he's the brother, well, not at this point, but we're going to find out that he's the brother of Mary and Martha. And so John does something a little different here in verse 2, because he says, "It was Mary who anointed the Lord with ointment and wiped his feet with her hair." He says it like it's already happened. But if you actually look at the chronological outline of this book, that actually doesn't happen until chapter 12. So why does he add it there? He adds it there because of the fact that he's first of all pointing to and telling people continue reading. But he's also, this was a story that was extremely important within the early church. These people would have known Mary. Oh, that's the Mary. Oh yeah, the one who wiped the feet of Jesus. Yeah, we know who that is. And so if you look at that, he's writing it very much saying, like, that's the Mary. The Mary that you all have heard of that wiped Jesus' feet. Yeah, that's Mary, whose sister is Martha and whose brother Lazarus was raised by Jesus. So he gives us that basically almost like foreshadowing, but not foreshadowing because it's, anyways. But he's pointing to the next chapter. So it says, whose brother Lazarus was ill. So the sisters sent to him, saying, Lord, he whom you love is ill. Now, let's look at that for a second. So Jesus' home base, and for a little while, it probably has been Bethany. He loves this family, spends time with this family, has a great relationship with this family. Jesus is no longer in Bethany at this point. He's traveled on. He's doing his ministry. He's continuing to preach the word. He's continuing to heal. He's continuing to do what Jesus is doing throughout his life. Now it says they sent to him. So that means that this family knew him so well that they would actually have somewhat of an itinerary of where he's going. They would know where he was going to go and preach, where he was going to go and teach, where he was going to go do everything that he needs to do. Because these people know him just as he knows them. But look at what it says. It says, Lord, he whom you love is ill. So they sent to him saying, Lazarus is sick. Come quick. But look at Jesus' response. Because he says this. When he heard of it, he said, the illness does not lead to death. We can just stop right there. It does not lead to death. Now, if you look at the heading, and my Bible says, the death of Lazarus is what my heading says. Jesus says it doesn't lead to death. Why would he say that if Lazarus is going to die? He's saying that because he knows what's actually going to take place. And it's not like this is one of those situations, and we can, just based off of the stories that have been told so far and what we know about who Jesus is so far, we can understand that this is not surprising Jesus about what's going on. You think about when Nathanael, in chapter 1, comes to Jesus. And Jesus basically like, yeah, I saw you while you were under the fig tree. Or you think of the woman in chapter 4 at the well where Jesus is talking to her and she says, I have no husband. And Jesus is like, of course you have no husband. You've been married 5 times and the man you're with isn't your husband. You think about the things that Jesus has done up to this point in this book, where it's almost like he has this supernatural ability to know everything. Do you think it was a surprise that Lazarus was sick? Do you think it was a surprise that he was going to die and probably at this point was already dead? It wasn't. And Jesus is showing that he's in control because he says this illness does not lead to death. It will be for the glory of God, so the Son of God may be glorified through it. And if you look at his response, this is so similar to the healing that takes place in John chapter 9. Because in John chapter 9, Jesus is healing a blind man who was born blind. And they ask him, "Teacher, who sinned, this person, this man, or was it his parents that he was born blind?" And Jesus' response is, "It was not that this man sinned or his parents, but that the works of God might be displayed in him." Jesus' response here is this is for the glory of God, that the Son might be glorified. That the Son, the one who Jesus has just said in the previous chapter, that he and the Father are one. This is for his glory so that he can glorify the Son and glorify the Father. What we have to realize is Jesus is basing, in his life was based off of God's timing. He came to do the will of the Father. He doesn't go immediately, but he's also showing the grand scheme of things, that he is sovereign. Because if you do look at the previous section, Jesus has just said that I and the Father are one. What he was doing is he was making himself equal with God. And if that's the case, then he's in full control. And Jesus responds that this illness does not lead to death, but instead this is going to be for God's glory, that the Son may be glorified through it, is pointing to the fact that he knows he's in full control. He 100% knows every single move that is about to take place and knows every variable that is along the way, but knows exactly how each variable is going to fall into place. He knows what's going on and he's in control. And it's so easy to read this story and start thinking through the idea of Jesus and his just his response of like, yeah, it's not going to lead to death, so let's, this is for God's glory. And you start thinking through that response and being like, if he loved them so much, why didn't he rush there? We're actually going to look at that in the next section as we look at verses 5 through 16. So let's take a look at what that has to say. 5 through 16 says this: "Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. So when he had heard Lazarus was ill, he stayed 2 days longer in the place he was. Then, after this, he said to his disciples, 'Let us go to Judea.' The disciples said to him, 'Rabbi, the Jews are just now seeking to stone you, and you are going there again?' Jesus answered, 'Are there not 12 hours in the day? If anyone walks in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. But if anyone walks at night, he stumbles, because the light is not in him.' After saying these things, he said to them, 'Our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I go to awaken him.' His disciples said to him, 'Lord, if he has fallen asleep, he will recover.' Now Jesus had spoken of his death, but they thought that he meant taking a rest in sleep. Then Jesus told them plainly, 'Lazarus has died. And for your sake I am glad I was not there, so that you may believe. But let us go to him.' So Thomas, called the twin, said to his fellow disciples, 'Let us also go, that we may die with him.'" Okay, so here we go. Here it is. Now Jesus loved Martha and her sister and Lazarus. And it's interesting that Martha is mentioned first. In the story in Luke, Martha is the host. So we can then say, and probably with just a good educated guess, make the conclusion that Martha is the oldest. So when it says that he loved them, he loved that family, he had a great relationship with that family. So when he heard that they were ill, he stayed 2 days longer. And think about that for a second. So Jesus hears that Lazarus is ill. So we have to put like a little bit of a timeline here, because it's not like It's not the 21st century. It's not like Martha just quickly pops out her phone and like texts Jesus and like, hey, Lazarus is sick, with, the like throw up emoji that we use. It's not like that. She sent out messengers to go and find Jesus. So you got to figure there's probably a day before they found Jesus. They knew whereabouts he would be, but they didn't know exactly where he'd be. So they'd have to go, you'd have to travel, you'd have to walk, you'd have to get there. So we have to say, okay, so a day's taken place. So Jesus hears this. And what does he do? He stays 2 more days. And then you have to say and probably guess that it would be another day to walk back. So we're looking at 4 days. Okay, so people can look at this and be like, man, Jesus caused Lazarus' death. He found out the guy was sick and then like just kind of like kicked around and did whatever he wanted so he would die. But let's take a look a little bit further. Because verse 17 says this, now when Jesus came, he found that Lazarus had already been in the tomb for 4 days. Okay, so that's 4 days. Okay, so Jesus travels for 1 day. Then he stays for 2 days. And then there's the 1 day of travel for them to find him. So that means Lazarus probably died basically right after these guys left to find Jesus. So Jesus didn't cause Lazarus' death. But instead, he was showing ultimately his sovereignty. He was showing how he's in control. And what's really interesting about that is he's actually then, at this point, especially when he goes and finally gets to Lazarus and calls him out, is actually going to destroy Jewish superstition, because the Jewish superstition is that the soul actually stays in the tomb with the body for 3 days, and then after 3 days loses hope and leaves. So the fact that Jesus doesn't go right back immediately then like casts all doubt, or would cast all doubt against the miracle that he just did resuscitation. Instead, what he's doing is resurrection. He's rising and raising Lazarus from the dead. There's no superstition. There's nothing that can discredit what Jesus is about to do. So we have to take that into account. You see, Jesus didn't cause Lazarus' death. It was already going to happen. So after the 2 days is up in verse 7, he says to his disciples, let's go to Judea again. And we have to realize that over and over and over and over and over again, the Jewish people, the Jewish leaders, the religious leaders have been trying to kill Jesus. They've been trying to arrest Jesus. They've been trying to stone Jesus. There's all these things. And his disciples are like, okay, teacher, the Jewish people have been trying to stone you, and you're going to go back? Jesus' answer is never one of fear, because we have to realize over and over again, Jesus has never allowed himself to be arrested because his hour had not yet come. And if Jesus knew that his hour had not yet come, that means that at this time he can go back. If his hour had not yet come, he can go back and do what he needs to do. And so Jesus responds and says, and he responds in this interesting way, because he says there are 12 hours in the day. If anyone walks in the light, let me turn the page here, in the day, he does not stumble, because he sees the light of the world. And so what Jesus is getting at is the very reality of where they lived. They're like very close to the equator, so there's 12 hours of daylight, there's 12 hours of night. And what Jesus is getting at is it's still light. He's still in the world, and he's still going to do the work that God has called him to do. Just because there's people that are trying to kill him, just because there's opposition, just because there's anything, it doesn't stop Jesus from doing what Jesus needs to do, which is the will of the Father. And like he said, this is going to happen to glorify the Father, that the Son will be glorified through it. And that what we actually see in a little bit is this is actually done for the sake of the disciples and for the sake of the family, and ultimately for the sake of us, that we might believe. And so, Jesus, in the 12 hours of daylight that he's working, like this guy is literally probably like the 11th hour and 45th minute of his day. But he finishes, and he's finishing strong. He's always going to do the will of the Father. And so he goes, but then he says, but if anyone walks at night, he stumbles because the light is not in him. Making reference to the fact that light and darkness is walking with God and not walking with God. And if anyone walks at night, he stumbles because the light's not in him. Making reference to the fact that they're not walking with God. They're not in a relationship with God. And so he says, after saying these things, he said, our friend Lazarus has fallen asleep, but I must go and awaken him. And it's interesting that he uses the word asleep, because this is not like something that was very common at that time. It's not common in the Old Testament. Now in 1st and 2nd Kings and 1st and 2nd Chronicles, as it's telling the stories of the kings of first Israel as a whole, and then Israel, the northern kingdom, and Judah, the southern kingdom, as it's telling the stories of the kings, as they would die, it would actually say, whatever the name of the king is, fell asleep and slept with his fathers. So in other words, it was a way of saying that they died. But here Jesus, for some reason, says, our friend has fallen asleep. But I must go awaken him. So he's saying, like, I'm going to go wake him up. He's fallen asleep, but I'm going to go wake him up. He's actually making reference to the death. The disciples said to him, Lord, if he's fallen asleep, he's going to recover. They take this very literally. And this is something that you see over and over and over and over again throughout this gospel. When Jesus was talking to the woman at the well, the Samaritan woman, he said, I have spring of living water. If you drink this, you're never going to be thirsty again. And the woman's like, oh man, I totally want. Give me something to drink where I will never be thirsty again. When Jesus is talking to Nicodemus, and he's like, hey, if you want to be into the kingdom, you got to be born again. And he's like, do I have to go back inside my mother's womb? He takes it very literally. There's so many times where Jesus says things and the people take it very literally. And once again, there's one of these moments because they're looking at it as if, okay, here's Lazarus. He's sick. The dude's just sleeping it off and he's going to get better. So Jesus has to plainly tell them, Lazarus has died. And so in verse 15, and for your sake, I'm glad I was not there so that you may believe. In other words, Jesus could have healed the sickness. Jesus, if he was there, he could have just stopped the sickness and not allowed Lazarus to die. But Jesus says that he's glad that he wasn't. Because he is going to show them something and he's going to do something for them that is going to increase their faith. But also increase the faith of ultimately like Lazarus and his family. But if you think about it, increase the faith of every single person who's ever read this story. Because Jesus is going to heal Lazarus, a guy who was in the tomb for 4 days. I don't know if you've ever been around a dead body before, but it doesn't take long for death to overcome a body. It is the weirdest thing you'll ever see. Within hours, the skin changes. Within hours, everything just stops. The body just stops. So imagine after 4 days what Lazarus would have been like. But yet Jesus is going to go there and he's going to bring him and call him out of the grave. And life is going to enter back into Lazarus. That is for the sake of his disciples that they will believe. It's for the sake of the family that they will believe. It's for the sake of us that we will believe. And so Jesus says, but let us go to him. So now we have Thomas. Thomas is the disciple who at the end of this book doubts that Jesus rose. And he's like, unless I can touch the wounds and yada, 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 I won't believe that who he is. And so within the Christian tradition, Thomas has always been considered the doubter. He's always been considered the one who asks the questions, the skeptic. But here's the reality of what he's saying. Because Thomas speaks up as Jesus is saying, hey guys, we're going to a place where they want to kill us. They want to kill me especially. Thomas looks at his disciples and says, let us go, that we may die with him. Where Jesus is going, so are we. There's a lot of courage in what Thomas says. There's a lot of boldness and strength in what Thomas says. The guy constantly gets written off as if he's this skeptic and this doubter. But here he says, Jesus is going, and he might die, but so will we. And that's where this passage ends. Jesus is now making plans. He's made plans. He's going to follow, or he's going to go to Lazarus. And he says that he's going to wake him up. And in this story, you have, first of all, Jesus finds out that Lazarus is sick and has died, and then he waits 2 days, and it's just this weird thing where it's just like Jesus just decides he's going to wait. What do we do with a passage like this story, where Jesus is basically like not following the timing of what people want him to do, but he's following his own timing, but he's doing it for the sake of the disciples' faith, that they may believe. He's doing it for the sake of the family's faith, so they can believe, and ultimately doing it for the sake of our faith, so that we can believe. What do we do with that? What is the so what for a passage like this? Let's spend the remainder of our time talking about that. I want you to just put yourself into this situation. Imagine you had a sick brother or a sick family member, and there was a guy that you knew who had, made these claims of who he was and things that he could have done, and he could have healed your brother, but he didn't come. He didn't come when you called him, but instead waited even more time. But even then, there's no way that he would have actually been able to get back in time. Because of the fact that your loved one had passed away. Put yourself into their shoes for a second. How would you feel? How would you feel? You'd be angry. You'd be disappointed. You'd be sad. You would mourn. You would grieve. You'd go through the plethora of different emotions that you could possibly go through as you're processing this. And what I find so interesting, and I'm going to just quickly skip into this next section, is that Mary, when she sees Jesus, says, "Lord, if you would have been here, my brother would not have died." But then her response is, "But I know whatever you ask from God, God will give you." She has seen the miracles and known of the miracles that Jesus has done. So she puts her trust in Jesus. The 12 who follow Jesus, his disciples, put their trust in Jesus because they're going to a place that's dangerous. But in a situation like this, I'm assuming that Mary and Martha, and even Lazarus before he passed away, probably had a timeline that they would have expected Jesus to come in. They probably had plans of their own. But they didn't know every single variable. It's just like in a strategy game. We don't know every single variable. But if the God of the universe is all-knowing, and there is a God of the universe who is all-knowing and all-powerful, he's going to know every single variable. There's going to be nothing that can surprise him. And what we see in this case, Jesus last week had just talked about the fact that he and the Father are one. Here he's showing it. He's showing how he knows every variable. Jesus could have went earlier and he would have known that Lazarus was sick. He could have easily went and healed his sickness. He could have easily went and after one day healed and raised Lazarus from the grave. But even then it would have been disputed because of the fact of Jewish superstition. Here he went and healed a man 4 days in the tomb. 4 days of decay and just his body going through the rigors of what death does. 4 days, and he calls him out. You see, if Jesus is God, we have to trust that he has everything in control. If God is all powerful and all knowing and perfect, we have to trust that he knows what's going on. He knows every variable. And the question is this. You hear this question quite frequently. I have a bookcase just over here beside me, and I'm looking at a section of books that ask the tough questions in Christianity. And over and over and over and over and over and over again. There's questions like, why does God allow suffering to happen? Why does God allow bad things to happen to people? Why does God... that question gets asked so much. And the reality is, we never know how God is going to work things in our life. We never know. But in this situation, we have an instance where Lazarus, one of Jesus' best friends, passed away, and Jesus raised him from the grave 4 days after he was in the tomb. Why? To show his power. To show his greatness. To show that God can use a bad situation for good. You want to know another reason and another way that God can use a bad situation for good? We live in a world where there's brokenness and sin, where there's death, where there's pain, where there's suffering. We live in a world where it's just broken. We see that, we feel that, we know that. God sent his son into this world, Jesus, who died on the cross, who was beaten, who was broken, who was betrayed, who went through all this garbage in this world. Why did he do it? To save us. You see, God knew that the ultimate sacrifice and the ultimate plan was to use the brokenness of this world, the fact that there's sin in this world, the fact that there's disease and there's hurt and there's pain in this world. He used that to ultimately show his great love for us, to send his son to die in our place. You see, if suffering didn't exist, Jesus wouldn't have died on the cross and couldn't have died on the cross. But suffering exists so that Jesus could show his great love for us, that while we were still enemies, he died on the cross. But what about the here and now? What about this life? What about the things that happen? To be fair, there's going to be times when you just don't know why stuff happened. You don't know why things happened. But the reality is in bad situations, we start asking questions. And when we start asking questions, we actually start to find God more. We start to draw deeper with God in our relationships. When everything is good and cozy, we become complacent in our faith because there's nothing to risk. There's no loss. There's no chance of anything happening. But the second something bad happens, it's amazing how quickly we turn back to prayer. We turn back to trusting in who God is and leaning upon him. Now, God doesn't cause those, but he uses the bad situations, just like he did in this place. And the fact is we have to be very aware how we respond in bad situations, how we respond in the tough things, how we respond. We have to trust that God is in control. Because if God is who God says he is in this book, then we have no reason but to trust him. We have no reason to not trust the God of the universe. And I want you to think through the tough times in your life. If you're a follower of Jesus, how has God revealed himself to you? If you're not a follower of Jesus, I want to ask you this question. In a tough time, as you've struggled and suffered and gone through just the craziness of this world, have you ever asked somebody to pray for you? Why is that your natural inclination? Maybe the God of the universe is trying to get your attention. Maybe the God of the universe is using the brokenness of this world to show how he's overcome and defeated the brokenness of this world by sending his son to die on the cross. Life is not easy. And even the Christian life is definitely not easy. But we have to trust that the God of the universe knows every variable. He knows every variable in such a way that he sent his son to die on the cross. And he planned that before the foundations of the earth. He knew exactly what was going to happen. We have to trust that and believe that. And that does take faith. How do we grow that? Continue spending time reading through this book. Continue spending time reading through the stories and the way that God has worked. Spend time with other people who know Jesus. Listen to their stories. Listen to the things that God has done in their life and how he's been faithful. Spend time getting to know the God of the universe. That's ultimately my challenge. You want to trust him more? Spend time getting to know him. Let's pray. Father, I thank you for today. I thank you, Lord, that you are the God of the universe and we can trust you. And Lord, I pray that this week you reveal yourself more and more to us, even though we don't deserve it. So we thank you for Jesus. We thank you that he died on the cross. And Lord, we thank you that we have this story so that we can believe in you even more. So we thank you, we love you, and we pray all this in the name of Jesus Christ. Amen. And so I just want to say, hey, thanks for taking time this week to listen. I'm going to be posting a video on Monday of some great news of where we're going to be meeting. And so, yeah, have a good week and thank you.